The second period music class always felt like a different world. It was a room filled with sounds that didn't belong in the rest of the school: the low hum of a cello, the bright trill of a flute, the confident tap of a foot keeping a rhythm only the owner could hear. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows, cutting through the dusty air and making the polished wood of the instruments glow. For most of the students, this room was a sanctuary, a place where their talents could shine. For Maya, it was a courtroom, and she was always on trial. She sat in the very back row, a spot she had claimed on the first day and never left. Her chair was tucked into the corner, as far away from the piano as possible. That piano. It sat in the front of the room, gleaming in black, like a beautiful, sleeping beast. To the others, it was an opportunity. To Maya, it was a monument to every single one of her failures. Its ivory keys seemed to mock her, reminding her of clumsy fingers and wrong notes. She kept her shoulders hunched, her head down, her long hair falling like a curtain to shield her from the room. She tried to make herself smaller, invisible. If she didn't move, didn't breathe too loudly, maybe no one would notice she was there, the teacher. Mr. Davison was a kind man with a patient smile, but even his presence couldn't calm the frantic hummingbird in her chest. He was walking around the room now, stopping to listen to a boy who was tapping out a complex rhythm on his desk with 2 pencils. The rhythm was perfect, effortless. Maya watched him, a familiar ache of envy tightening in her stomach. It seemed so easy for everyone else. They could open their mouths and a perfect melody would come out. Or they could pick up an instrument and make it sing. Music was a language they were all born fluent in, but for Maya, it was a foreign country where she was constantly lost. Dobson clapped his hands lightly, and the low chatter in the room died down. "All right, everyone, settle down," he said, his voice warm and cheerful. "I hope you've all been practicing. As you know, the end-of-term recital is just around the corner." A collective, dramatic groan rippled through the students. It was the kind of groan that was more for a show than anything, a routine complaint about homework. But for Maya, the words "end of term recital" hit her like a physical blow. It felt like a stone dropping into her stomach, cold and heavy. Her breath caught in her throat. "No, not that." "Anything but that." Mr. Davison chuckled at their reaction. "Oh, come on now, it won't be that bad. In fact, this year we're going to do things a little differently. To make sure everyone is prepared, and to get some practice performing in front of each other, the final week of class will be dedicated to mandatory solo performances. Right here. For all of us." The room went silent. The groans stopped. This was new. This was real, mandatory. Maya could feel her heart starting to pound against her ribs, a frantic, trapped beat. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, wishing she could melt through the floorboards. She could already feel the heat creeping up her neck. She imagined herself up there, on the little stage, all those eyes on her. Her mind went blank, filled only with the imagined sound of a single, sour, echoing note. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Mr. Davison said, misinterpreting the silence as concentration. "We still have a few weeks, but let's start warming up those performance muscles today. Let's have a quick, simple warm-up. Just a C major scale. Nothing fancy." "Maya," he said, his eyes landing on her, "why don't you start us off?" Her name hung in the air. For a horrifying second, she thought she hadn't heard him correctly. But then every head in the room seemed to turn in her direction, a slow, synchronized motion. The curtain of her hair suddenly felt useless. She was exposed. Her entire body went rigid. She could feel 100 pairs of eyes on her, and she was sure they could all see the terror on her face. She wanted to say no. She wanted to shake her head, to invent a sudden illness, to do anything. But her feet were already moving, as if pulled by invisible strings. The walk to the front of the room felt like the longest journey of her life. Each step was heavy, deliberate. She could hear the soft squeak of her sneakers on the linoleum floor. The sunlight from the windows seemed to intensify, a bright, accusing spotlight that followed her every move. She kept her gaze fixed on the piano, her personal monster waiting for her. She sat on the cold, hard bench. The wood felt unnaturally solid beneath her. She placed her trembling hands on the keys. They felt sticky, foreign. The room was so quiet she could hear her own blood rushing in her ears. She took a shaky breath, trying to remember where to put her fingers. C major. It was the first scale anyone ever learned. It was supposed to be easy. Her thumb, clumsy and stiff, jabbed at a C key. A dull thud came out instead of a clear, ringing note. A flicker of panic went through her. She pushed on. Her index finger went for the D, but it landed just a little to the side, hitting the black key next to it. A sour, jarring sound cut through the silence. Like a tiny scream, a few sharp little coughs of laughter erupted from the class. They were quickly stifled, but it was too late. Maya's face felt like it was on fire. She risked a glance at the students. Most were just looking, but she saw him. Leo, he was the best musician in the class, maybe in the whole school. He could play anything, his fingers dancing across the keys with an easy grace that Maya could only dream of. He was leaning back in his chair, a small, pitying smirk on his face. He wasn't even trying to hide his amusement. He whispered something to the girl next to him, and she giggled behind her hand. That was it. The string inside Maya snapped. She couldn't do it. Her mind went completely blank. The simple pattern of the scale, the one she had practiced 100 times alone in her room, was gone. All she could see was Leo's face, all she could hear was that tiny, humiliating giggle. Her fingers froze, hovering over the keys. She couldn't remember the next note. Was it E or F? It didn't matter. She couldn't make them move. "That's enough for now, Maya. Thank you," Mr. Davison said, his voice gentle, but his gentleness was almost worse than anger. It was a confirmation of her failure. She pulled her hands back as if the keys had burned her, and stood up so quickly she almost knocked the bench over. She didn't look at anyone. She just walked, her head down, back to her safe corner. The eyes of the class followed her. She could feel them like a physical weight. When she finally sat down, she curled into herself, making herself as small as possible. She stared at a small scuff mark on the floor, focusing all her energy on it, trying to block out the world. The rest of the class faded into a blur of sound and color. Mr. Davison called someone else up to the piano, and they played the scale perfectly, of course. The notes were clear and bright, everything hers hadn't been. But Maya didn't really hear it. She was lost in her own bubble of burning shame. In that moment, she wasn't just a girl who had messed up. She was the girl who couldn't play the piano, and in her mind, everyone in the room knew it. The walk home from school was a blur. Maya moved through the bustling streets like a ghost, her backpack feeling heavier than it ever had before, not with books, but with the weight of the afternoon's humiliation. Every car horn, every shout from a group of friends, every burst of laughter seemed to be directed at her. She kept her head down, her hands shoved deep into her pockets, replaying the scene in the music room over and over again. The sour note, the stifled giggles, and most of all, Leo's smirk. It was a tiny, cruel little curve of his lips, but it had burned itself into her memory. Her house was quiet when she got home, the way it always was. Her mother was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, and she smiled when Maya walked in. "How was school, sweetie?" she asked, her voice cheerful and oblivious. "Fine," Maya mumbled, dropping her bag by the door. She couldn't bring herself to look at her mother. She felt like a fraud, pretending everything was normal when inside. She was a tangled mess of shame and anger. Dinner was a quiet affair. Her father talked about his day at work, and her mother asked about an upcoming test. But Maya just pushed her food around her plate, offering one-word answers. All she could think about was the piano. It was sitting in the living room, just through the archway, a silent, black witness to her failure. It had been her grandmother's, a beautiful, upright piano with polished wood that gleamed under the soft lamplight. Her grandmother had been a real musician, someone who could make the instrument sing and weep. After she passed away, the piano became a shrine, a piece of her that they couldn't let go of. Her parents kept it tuned, polished, and waiting, as if one day she might just walk back through the door and sit down to play. They never pushed Maya to learn, but the unspoken expectation was always there, a heavy blanket of legacy that she felt she could never live up to. That night, sleep was impossible. Maya lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the day's events playing on a loop in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of her classmates. She could feel the heat of her own embarrassment all over again. It was a suffocating feeling, a pressure building in her chest with nowhere to go. She tossed and turned, her sheets tangled around her legs. Finally, around midnight, she couldn't take it anymore. She threw back the covers and slipped out of bed. The house was dark and silent, filled with the soft, sleeping breaths of her parents. She padded down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the cool wooden floor. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew she couldn't just lie there and let the shame eat her alive. She found herself in the living room, standing before the piano. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, it looked less like a beautiful instrument and more like a monster. Hulking in the corner, a flicker of defiance, hot and sudden, sparked inside her. Who were they to laugh at her? Who was Leo to judge her? She sat down on the bench, the cold wood a shock against her skin. She lifted the lid, revealing the black and white keys. For a moment she hesitated, the old fear creeping back in. But then she remembered the pity in Leo's eyes, and the fear was replaced by a surge of anger. She wasn't going to play their stupid scales. She wasn't going to play their simple, boring songs. She was going to play something real. She reached into the bench's storage compartment, her fingers brushing against dusty, forgotten books. She pulled out a stack of old sheet music. On top was a book her grandmother had used, the pages yellowed and soft with age. Her grandmother's name was written on the front in elegant, looping cursive. Inside, there were notes in the margins, little reminders and suggestions written in a familiar, gentle hand. Maya flipped through the pages, her fingers tracing the faded ink. She didn't recognize most of the titles. They were complex, filled with notes that looked like a swarm of black ants. Then she found it. Tucked in the back was a separate sheaf of papers held together by a clip. The title was written in her grandmother's handwriting, Sonata for a Lonely Heart. It looked difficult, far too difficult for her. The notes were dense, there were sharps and flats on every line, and the tempo markings were words she didn't fully understand, like appassionato and condolora. It was perfect. She placed the sheets on the music stand. She took a deep breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't doing this for a grade. She wasn't doing this for Mr. Davison or her parents or anyone else. She was doing this for herself. She was doing this because she was angry and sad and frustrated, and she didn't know how to say it with words. Her fingers found the keys. She began to play. It was a disaster. The first few notes came out as a jumbled, discordant mess. Her fingers, stiff with anxiety, fumbled and missed their marks. A harsh, ugly chord rang out, making her flinch. She almost stopped right there, ready to give up and retreat back to the suffocating silence of her room. But then she tried again. This time she focused on just the first few bars. She played them slowly, one note at a time. A melody began to emerge, a sad, haunting tune that seemed to echo the loneliness she felt. She played it again, a little faster this time. It wasn't perfect. There were mistakes, plenty of them. But for the first time, the mistakes didn't matter. The loud, crashing chords she played when she felt a surge of anger at Leo felt right. The soft, whispering notes she used for the sadder parts of the melody felt like a release. She wasn't just pressing keys. She was having a conversation with her own heart. The piano was no longer a judge. It was a listener. Night after night she would wait until the house was asleep, then sneak downstairs to the piano. The sonata became her secret. It was a world that belonged only to her, a place where the humiliation from her music class couldn't reach her. Her fingers, which had felt so clumsy and useless in the classroom, began to know the music. They learned the patterns, the jumps, the intricate runs. The calluses on her fingertips grew harder. She started to memorize the piece until she could close her eyes and let her fingers find their own way across the keys. The melody, once a stranger, became a friend, a secret companion in the silent house. During the day, she was still the quiet girl in the back of the class. But at night, sitting at her grandmother's piano, she was someone else. She was strong. She was passionate. and she was making something beautiful out of her pain. The day of the recital arrived with a gray, overcast sky that matched the knot of dread in Maya's stomach. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. She went through her morning routine in a daze, brushing her teeth and getting dressed without really seeing anything. The cereal in her bowl tasted like cardboard, and the cheerful chatter of her parents at the breakfast table sounded like it was coming from another room, far away. All she could think about was the piano. Not the one in her living room, her secret ally, but the one on the stage at school, the public enemy. Her music folder felt like a lead weight in her backpack. Inside were the pages of her grandmother's sonata, the notes now familiar friends, but in the light of day they seemed fragile, like a secret that wouldn't survive the harsh glare of the auditorium lights. On the bus to school, she kept her backpack clutched to her chest, a protective shield. She watched the city streets blur past, her reflection a pale, ghostly face in the window. Who was she trying to fool? She was still the girl who couldn't play a simple C major scale. The past few weeks of secret, midnight practice felt like a dream, something that had happened to someone else. The school was already buzzing with a nervous energy. That was different from a regular school day. The hallways were filled with students carrying instrument cases, their faces a mixture of excitement and anxiety. They were all in the same boat, but Maya felt completely alone. She was an imposter, carrying a secret weapon she wasn't sure she knew how to use. She found her way to the auditorium, a large, echoing space that smelled of old velvet and floor wax. The stage was set up with a single grand piano under a bright spotlight. Looking like an island in a sea of darkness, backstage was chaos. Students were tuning their instruments, running through scales, and whispering last-minute words of encouragement to each other. Maya found a quiet corner in the wings, hidden by a heavy velvet curtain, and just watched. She felt like a spy behind enemy lines. A girl with a violin was practicing a fast, complicated passage, her bow flying across the strings. A group of boys with guitars were laughing and strumming a popular rock song. They all seemed so confident, so sure of their place here. They belonged. Maya just wanted to disappear. The recital began. One by one, students walked out onto the stage. A girl with a beautiful voice sang a popular pop song. Her voice was a little shaky at first, but she hit all the right notes and the audience clapped politely. A boy who was new to the trumpet played a simple, classical piece. He missed a few notes and his face turned red, but the audience was kind, and he got a warm round of applause for his effort. Each performance made Maya's heart beat a little faster. They were all so brave. She didn't feel brave. She felt sick. Then it was Leo's turn. He walked onto the stage with an easy confidence, as if he owned it. He didn't carry any sheet music. He just sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed his long, elegant fingers on the keys. He played a Chopin etude, a piece that was notoriously difficult. And he played it perfectly. His fingers were a blur of motion, dancing across the keys with a speed and precision that was breathtaking. The music was complicated, technical, and flawless. It was like watching a machine execute a perfect program. It was impressive, but to Maya it felt empty. There was no heart in it, no soul. It was just a display of skill. When he finished, the audience erupted in applause. It was the loudest applause of the night so far. People were even standing up. Leo took a modest bow, a small, satisfied smile on his face, and walked off the stage. As he passed Maya in the wings, he saw her huddled in the corner. He paused for a moment, and his eyes met hers. That same pitying smirk from the music class was back on his face. It was a look that said, "Good luck trying to follow that." It wasn't just pity. It was condescending. It was the look of someone who had already won. In that moment, something inside Maya shifted. The fear was still there, a cold, hard lump in her throat. But under it, a tiny spark of anger began to glow. He was looking down on her. He was underestimating her, just like he had before. He thought she was nothing. He thought she was just the quiet girl in the back who couldn't play. "Maya," a voice said, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Mr. Davison. "You're up next." Her blood ran cold. This was it. There was no more hiding. The walk from the wings to the center of the stage was the longest walk of her life. The lights were blinding, and she couldn't see the faces in the audience, just a vast, dark void. The sound of her own footsteps seemed to echo in the silent auditorium. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, and she imagined what they were thinking. Who is this? I've never seen her perform. She's probably just going to play something simple and mess it up. She reached the piano and sat down on the bench. It was cold and smooth. The polished wood of the grand piano reflected the harsh lights like a mirror. She placed her folder on the music stand, her hands trembling so much she could barely get the pages out. She didn't need the music. She knew every note of the sonata by heart. But having it there felt like a security blanket, a small piece of her secret world in this terrifying public space. She looked out at the darkness, at the invisible crowd. She thought of Leo's perfect, empty performance. She thought of the snickers in the classroom. She thought of the long, lonely nights practicing, pouring all her sadness and frustration into the keys. She was not here to be perfect. She was not here to show off her skill. She was here to tell a story. Her story. She closed her eyes, shutting out the lights, the crowd, and the fear. She took a deep, shaky breath and let it out slowly. She was no longer in the auditorium. She was back in her living room in the middle of the night with only the moonlight as her witness. Her fingers, which had been trembling just a moment ago, were suddenly still. They hovered over the keys, ready to finally be heard. Her fingers, which had been trembling with a fear so cold it felt like ice, now felt strangely calm as they hovered over the keys. The blinding spotlight, the vast, dark void of the audience, the suffocating weight of expectation, it all began to fade away. It was like stepping into a soundproof room. The only thing that existed was her, the piano, and the memory of the music she had poured her soul into for weeks. She took one last, deep breath, the air filling her lungs and pushing back against the knot of dread. Then she began to play. The first few notes were not loud or confident. They were soft, almost hesitant, like a question being whispered into the silence. A single clear melody emerged, simple and sad. It was the sound of loneliness, of feeling invisible in a crowded room. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. This was not the clumsy scale they had been expecting. It was something else, something fragile and unexpectedly beautiful. In the wings, Leo, who had been zipping up his instrument case, paused his movements. His head tilted slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. Then the music began to change. The soft whisper of a melody grew stronger, more insistent. Maya's fingers, which had been moving slowly, began to find their rhythm. She was no longer just playing notes. She was telling a story. The story of the quiet girl in the back of the class, of the burning shame of a public failure, of the long, lonely nights spent channeling that pain into something real. A low, rumbling bass line joined the melody, creating a sense of tension, of a storm gathering on the horizon. The audience was completely still now. The whispers had died. The faint rustling of programs had ceased. Everyone was leaning forward, captivated. They weren't just listening to a song. They were feeling an emotion. It was raw and powerful and utterly honest. Mr. Davison, sitting in the front row, had a small, knowing smile on his face. He had seen a spark in this quiet girl, a flicker of something deeper, but he had never imagined this. He was watching a transformation unfold in real time. The music swelled, rising from a quiet stream into a raging river. Maya's left hand began to move in complex patterns, a storm of chords that gave the melody a dramatic, sweeping foundation. Her right hand flew across the keys, playing runs of notes that were so fast they seemed to blur, a cascade of sound that was both technically difficult and emotionally devastating. This was the anger. This was the frustration. This was her screaming at the pitying smirks and the stifled giggles without ever saying a word. The sound filled every corner of the vast auditorium, a roar of defiance that echoed off the walls and shook the very air. Leo was no longer smirking. He was standing perfectly still, his case forgotten at his feet. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide with a disbelief that was rapidly turning into awe. He had played his piece with flawless, machine-like precision. He had executed every note perfectly, but this was something he couldn't comprehend. This girl, the one he had dismissed as untalented, was playing with a passion, a fire, that he had never been able to find in his own music. She wasn't just hitting the right notes. She was making the piano weep and cry and shout. She was making it come alive. The sonata reached its peak. The melody soared to a heartbreakingly high note, held for a moment, hanging in the air like a tear about to fall. Then it came crashing down. Maya's hands came down on the keys in a series of loud, crashing chords that were the musical equivalent of a thunderclap. It was the sound of a breaking point, of a dam bursting and releasing a flood of pent-up emotion. It was the sound of her humiliation being washed away, replaced by a newfound strength. For a moment, it was pure chaos, a beautiful, terrifying storm of sound. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The crashing chords faded away, leaving behind a single, haunting melody that was a softer, more hopeful version of the one she had started with. It was the sound of the sun coming out after a rainstorm, the feeling of taking a deep, clean breath after being underwater for too long. She played it gently, her fingers caressing the keys, pouring all the hope she had into those final notes. It was a promise to herself that she would never feel that small, that invisible. Ever again. She played the final, resonant chord. Her foot pressed the sustained pedal, and the note hung in the air, shimmering and beautiful, slowly fading into silence. And in that silence, the world held its breath. It was a profound, heavy silence. Not the awkward silence of a performance gone wrong, but the stunned, reverent silence of an audience that had just witnessed something extraordinary. No one moved. No one spoke. For 3 full seconds, the only sound in the auditorium was the faint, ghostly vibration of the final note as it disappeared into the rafters. They were all processing what they had just heard. The quiet girl from the back of the class had just torn their hearts open and put them back together again. Then, from the front row, a single person began to clap. It was Mr. Davison. It wasn't polite, perfunctory applause. It was a strong, steady clap of genuine admiration and pride. Another person joined in, then another, like the first drops of a rainstorm. Suddenly, a wave of sound erupted. The entire auditorium burst into thunderous, overwhelming applause. It wasn't just clapping. It was a roar of appreciation, a release of all the emotion the performance had stirred in them, but they didn't just stay in their seats. One by one, then in groups, people began to rise. The applause grew louder as the entire audience got to their feet in a spontaneous, genuine standing ovation. They were not just being polite. They were standing because they were compelled to, because the performance had demanded it. They were standing for the girl they had underestimated, for the story she had told them, for the raw, breathtaking beauty they had just experienced. Maya sat at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, completely stunned. The silence of her trance was broken by the wall of sound. She slowly opened her eyes, blinking against the harsh lights. She saw the dark void of the audience now filled with a standing, cheering crowd. She saw their faces, some with tears in their eyes, all smiling, all clapping for her. The heat that rose in her cheeks this time was not the fire of embarrassment, but the warm glow of shock and disbelief. A slow, uncertain smile spread across her face as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She had done it. She had taken her deepest shame and turned it into her greatest strength. She rose from the bench and walked to the center of the stage, the spotlight no longer feeling like an interrogation lamp but a warm, embracing hug. She took a deep bow, her heart pounding with a new, exhilarating rhythm. Maya stood on the stage, the roar of the applause washing over her like a warm wave. It was a sound so loud, so all-consuming, it felt like it was coming from inside her own head. For a long moment, she just stood there, her mind a complete blank. The bright lights of the auditorium blurred into a single, blinding star, and the faces of the standing audience were just a shapeless, cheering sea. She had bowed, but she didn't even remember doing it. Her body was moving on its own, running on a program of shock and disbelief. This wasn't the polite, clapping for effort kind of applause she was used to hearing for other students. This was different. This was raw, powerful, and real. It was for her. Slowly, as if waking from a dream, she turned and walked off the stage. Her legs felt unsteady, like they might give out at any moment. The moment she stepped back into the wings, the world rushed back in. The heavy velvet curtain brushed against her arm, and the dim, chaotic energy of backstage enveloped her. But it was a different kind of chaos now. As she made her way through the narrow space, a path seemed to clear for her. The students who were waiting to perform or had already performed stopped what they were doing and turned to look at her. But this time, their eyes weren't filled with pity or indifference. They were wide with a mixture of awe and respect. A girl with a flute, the same one who had giggled with her friend after Maya's disastrous scale attempt, rushed up to her. "Oh my gosh," she breathed, her eyes shining. "That was, I don't even have the words. I am so sorry for laughing before. I had no idea. You were incredible." Maya just stared at her, unable to form a response. The apology felt surreal, like a scene from a movie happening to someone else. Another student, a boy with a guitar, gave her a thumbs up and a wide, genuine smile. "You killed it up there," he said. "Seriously." The compliments came from all directions, a gentle rain of validation that began to wash away the last traces of her shame. She was no longer a ghost. She was the center of attention, and for the first time in her life, it didn't feel terrifying. It felt good. As she was putting her sheet music back into her folder, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Leo standing there. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't looking at her with pity. His expression was complicated, a mixture of shock, humility, and something that looked a lot like respect. He held his polished, expensive-looking instrument case in his hand, but he seemed to have forgotten about it. For a moment, he just stood there, searching for the right words. The old Maya would have shrunk away, expecting another cutting remark. But the new Maya, the one who had just poured her heart out on that stage, held his gaze. I don't know what to say," he finally said, his voice quiet and sincere. "I've never heard anything like that. The way you play, it's not just about the notes. It's about everything." He shook his head as if trying to clear it. "My performance was just a bunch of notes. Yours was a story. I'm sorry if I ever made you feel. Well, you're on a completely different level." He didn't wait for a response. He just gave her a small, respectful nod and walked away. In that moment, the last piece of the armor she had built around her heart fell away. She didn't need it anymore. His validation, more than anyone else's, confirmed her victory. She hadn't just impressed them. She had impressed the one person she thought was unimpressed. Mr. Davison found her by the curtain, a warm, proud smile lighting up his face. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He just put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I knew there was a story in there," he said softly, his eyes twinkling. "You just needed to find the right way to tell it. You found your voice today, Maya. Don't ever lose it." His words were simple, but they meant the world to her. He hadn't just seen a struggling student. He had seen potential, a quiet spark waiting for a chance to ignite. He was the one who had unknowingly given her the stage to do it. The walk home was different from the walk to school that morning. The world seemed to have snapped into high definition. The gray sky was no longer gloomy, but a soft, dramatic backdrop. The city noises weren't a threat, but the soundtrack to her new life. She felt taller, as if a weight she had been carrying for years had been lifted off her shoulders. She walked with her head up, not out of arrogance, but out of a quiet confidence. She saw the world differently because, for the first time, she felt like she was a real part of it. When she got home, the house was quiet, just as it had been the night before. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't a lonely, empty silence. It was a peaceful one. She walked into the living room and saw the piano. It was the same beautiful, upright piano that had been a source of so much fear and pressure for so long. It still held the memory of her grandmother, but it was no longer just a shrine to the past. It was her past, her present, and her future. She sat down on the bench. the smooth wood feeling familiar and comforting under her. She ran her fingers over the keys, but she didn't play the sonata. The sonata had served its purpose. It was an exorcism, a battle cry, a confession. It was the story of the girl she used to be. Now, it was time to tell the story of the girl she was becoming. She closed her eyes, and a new melody began to form in her mind. It wasn't sad or angry. It was hopeful, a little uncertain, but full of light. It was simple, with a clear, bright tune that felt like the first rays of sunshine after a long night. Her fingers began to move, picking out the notes. It was her own music, something that was coming directly from her. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't technically difficult, but it was honest. It was the sound of her own voice, clear and strong, finally free to sing. The piano was no longer a monument to her failures or her grandmother's legacy. It was just an instrument, and she was a musician. And in the quiet of her living room, with the afternoon light streaming through the window, she played, not for an audience or for a grade, but for the sheer joy of it.